Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today today is Monday, February 3rd, and yeah, there's so much to go over. It's hard to know where to start. I feel like every presidential election that I lived through, nothing really changed. It was like choosing between Pepsi and
Right.
Coke. You always got the same thing. But this time it feels way different. I mean, what's your view? Are we living through a truly unique time in history? Have you ever seen anything like this?
No, I haven't. Yeah, it's very hard to predict how all of this is gonna end. But I've never seen a presidential term start like this. Yeah, Trump is serious. He's kind of on a rampage, and a lot of it, there are many different things going on here at the same time, and I think maybe we need to break them apart. I think one is that he is going after the deep state. He understands that his first term was crippled really by the deep state, and that he had people under him and beside him who were not loyal to him. So this time, I think first, as we said earlier, when he um, chose his cabinet members and other high-ranking officials, he was careful to choose people that he were personally loyal to him. Some of these people might have ideologies that are not really aligned with them, but they're personally loyal. I think that's clear. And now that he has them there, he's in their positions in the government. He's instructing them to go after you know those people that were responsible, for example, the Russia hoax, or the first impeachment attempt. These were all efforts to really cripple or end his first term. And so he has an understanding that he really needs to clean house. And he seems to be going about it quite vigorously. It's really quite astonishing. Um, then there's his, let's say, you could say, broader economic policy, and I think this is probably the most problematic aspect of this revolution that Trump seems to be unleashing on us. He's slapping tariffs on different countries. He talked about it, but he's actually done it. 25% tariffs on Mexico, on Canada, 10% on China. And those are going to have real economic consequences for us. It's going to be, and I think even Trump admitted it, we're going to have to pay a price for this. And it's not clear that it's going to achieve any objective. Now, maybe it will, especially, when you're dealing with weaker, dependent countries. And I think you can say that about Mexico. Mexico is not Colombia. Colombia had to throw in the towel, at the moment that Trump made a threat. If you remember, he was going to send deportees back to Colombia, and the Colombians refused to allow the planes to land. And then then he threatened tariffs, and then the Colombians just, raised their hands. They surrendered because, as a Colombian friend was just telling me yesterday, they're just utterly dependent on the U.S. Colombia is. I think you could say something about Mexico, not to such a great extent. Mexico is a much larger country with a larger economy, but I think its trade is almost entirely dependent on the U.S. So that really, these tariffs really put them in a bind. I think they've already threatened some kind of retaliation. Um, but then let's say, look at the objectives of what he's doing here in let's say in Mexico. He points to drugs and immigration. Now, I think he's on firm ground when it comes to immigration. Mexico itself has actually a very strict, immigration policy. And if you are in one of the Central American countries, you want to go into Mexico, if you don't do it the right way, and it's difficult to enter or immigrate certainly into Mexico legally from those countries. If you sneak across the border, they grab you and they throw you back. If they think you're just going into Mexico. But they let people go through Mexico and from Mexico into the U.S. This is what happened under Biden and in administrations previous to Trump. So one thing that Trump did is that he made clear, like in his first term, I think you'd have to say that this is one promise that he at least partially made good on, and that is that he really did cut down the flow. said no more nonsense. And I think, um, I think that this is something clearly that the Mexicans can do. They've demonstrated in the past they can reduce the flow of illegal immigration to the U.S. But the other part is the drugs, and I think that's I don't know if they can solve that problem. The cartels are so powerful in Mexico. They run regions of the country basically. They're the real authority in parts of the country. Um, Now, so I have my doubts about whether the government, even if it really, really, truly wants to get rid of these cartels, whether it can. And the effort to do it would probably unleash something like a very bloody civil war. So I don't see a good ending to this. I really don't. Um, and then Canada, I don't really know what Canada is guilty of. I guess, some drugs have come over. It just seems like you could work with them, make clear ahead of time. I find this whole thing, maybe I'm just very naive, but just rather reckless on the part of Trump. And there, as he himself admitted, there will be real economic consequences for the U.S. These tariffs, we actually import a lot of goods from both these countries and, of course, from China. Now, it's not a 25% tariff on China, but 10% is still considerable. So the three of them together account for, I think, well over half of our imports. And that it's going to result in inflation. It's hard to say exactly how much, but clearly it will. It raises the prices. You say on the beneficial side, well, I guess the government gets more revenues and can maybe start to address some of the fiscal problems. But there will be a real, an immediate cost to consumers in this country. And then there's also the threat of retaliations, which Canada has already carried out. They've mirrored, our tariffs with 25% tariffs of their own. So we export quite a few goods into Canada, and that harms our exports. And then don't forget too that businesses in this country, even ones, that export also depend on imports. They have inputs, they have domestic inputs, but they also may depend on maybe a certain material or component or something which they import from Canada or from China. And then when these become more expensive, these businesses become less competitive on the international market. So there are all kinds of costs. I'm not kind of a purist when it comes to this. I think there is a place in some cases for some kind of tariffs. They can be helpful to a country at certain stages and certain sectors. There's an argument to be made for them, but these blanket 25% tariffs, I think may lead to, it's definitely going to lead to a recession in Mexico. They know that that's happening. And one thing that happens, of course, is that when Mexico's economy takes a dive, immigration increases from Mexico. People go, lose their jobs in Mexico, they go north. So it could even have the opposite effect of what he was intending. Yeah, so again, this is the part of his scheme that really seems to me very reckless and could backfire very seriously. The other thing is, though, that he seems to be going after the foreign policy establishment in a big way, and which I really think needed to be done. We've talked about the cutoff, the 90-day freeze in foreign aid, exceptions for Egypt and Israel, of course. But so far, it seems like he's sticking to his guns, and in spite of all the cries of outrage, about the cutoff to Ukraine, because Ukraine is part of it. So far, he's not made an exception for it. Now, again, we really are talking about civilian aid. It's possible that some military aid might be affected, but nobody's come up with any example of it yet. I think it appears that the military aid is flowing just as before. But the civilian aid is significant. I mean, again, this is a country that's entirely dependent on Western largesse. It could not survive. The economy could not survive. So, they do need to get this funding just to continue to function as a nation. They can't just receive arms. They also have to feed people, pay salaries. The government will collapse if there isn't funding. And of course, they still are getting funding from Europe. There may be other sources within the U.S., so it's not over. But it must, as we're saying, there's no doubt that it's causing some panic, some very serious anxiety in Ukraine. And then I found this very interesting. I don't know if you know, but the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, gave an interview to Megyn Kelly. Mm-hmm. And I didn't listen to it directly, but I heard transcripts of it. And he sounded like he could have been on our show on Friday. I mean, right. Seriously, he was making the same points that I was making, saying that, hey, multipolarity is normal. It's, this unipolar thing that was a strange historical exception. And that's exactly what he said. He described, the unipolar moment as an anomaly. Now we're returning to, what's normal. And he actually used the word multipolarity. I was stunned because, Marco Rubio, of all people, he was just like the most establishment of establishment Republicans without really any evidence that he thought otherwise until this interview. And he was very much a neocon in his foreign policy orientation. I think you really have to struggle to find something that suggests otherwise in his past record. But here he was talking, and the thing is, he was speaking about it intelligently. I don't think he was just, mouthing some slogans. And you say, oh, well, maybe he's just doing this it's a dog whistle. Well, it would be more than a dog whistle, but he's trying to appeal to the base. The truth is, though we would like to believe otherwise, there isn't a significant foreign policy base in this country. Again, the polls show that there's like 4% of people decide their vote on the basis of foreign policy. I think it should be more because that's where the government can really make a difference. It's harder to steer the economy. It's easier to mess up the economy, but you can end ridiculous foreign adventures, and to the benefit of the U.S. and of the world. That's something the president really can do. So people should pay more attention to it, but generally they don't. So I don't think he had to do it. It was just something like, okay, yeah, we want to impress these certain people and get votes or whatever. I got the impression that he really believed what he was saying. He was speaking like somebody who really understood what was going on. And he talked about spheres of influence. And the one part, which is a kind of a regrettable tendency among a lot of Republicans who are otherwise, I think, show themselves to be realists. Maybe you could say they're still realists, but I still find it regrettable. There tends to be a lot of animosity towards China. Say, yeah, let's forget Ukraine, but let's shift over to China. And he did have some of that, but even there, he spoke differently about China than, let's say, Anthony Blinken would have. He said, they have their own interests and, they have their own sphere of influence. He admitted it. But then he spoke about, their malign behavior.
Right.
But at least there is a recognition of that. That's the thing with the neocons. They don't even recognize that other countries have their own interests. Everybody has to submit to the rules-based international or international rule-based order, right? Which is to say Western hegemony. So there was a dose of realism. I think the only part of it was where we saw no change is when he spoke about Iran and, described them as a rogue regime. And, they essentially that he didn't hint at any change in policy with respect to Iran. But overall, it was a remarkable talk. And then, last again in the foreign policy sphere, we're seeing what looks like USAID is in danger of actually being shut down. It's I think a lot of its employees have been maybe not dismissed, but have been told to, or have been put on leave. Right. Yeah, right. And there's talk about maybe, getting rid of this agency, which as I've said previously, I've seen every president, talk about ending, reducing government and ending agencies, and it just never happens. So we'll see if it really does happen. But it looks like he's quite serious about it. And they say, well, why go after USAID? Actually, in my mind, it was kind of an innocuous agency. I had a neighbor of ours. I don't know if you remember him, but he was had a background in lumber mills and the wood industry. He actually made some trips to Russia. This was in the early 2000s through USAID, and that's the thing they're supposed to do. It's supposed to be about economic development in foreign countries. So that was my thought of my impression of USAID. But then I did some research and found out that actually they do a lot more than that, and they have actually funded many color revolutions. They are. It's not so much that they act directly, but they fund these other NGOs in countries like Georgia or Belarus or Russia earlier, Ukraine and so forth, and have. It seems to me it goes beyond their mandate, but that's what they were doing.
Yeah, we're back. Sorry about that. Some technical difficulties.
All right.
Let me take it back just a little bit, or look at it from this angle. So something we were talking about before was that the idea of Trump coming in and cleaning house, and Elon Musk with the Department of Governmental Efficiency, that they'll want to do all these things, but then they'll meet this bureaucratic machine that won't allow it to happen. But what I'm kind of surprised about is that we're seeing, in my opinion, not a lot of resistance from the establishment.
Right.
Trump and Elon are coming in like a wrecking ball and just putting these agencies through the wood chipper, just shredding them and just really disrupting it. And it just seems like the deep state is just throwing up their hands, or they're in chaos. I don't know. Well, what's your take on that?
Yeah, no, I'm surprised by that too. I mean, he seems to really have put them on the back foot. The contrast with his first term, or the beginning of his first term, could not be more stark. You think about it, like from the beginning, or even before he took office, there's this constant, there's a constant stream of accusations hurled against him. Again, he was accused of being some kind of a Manchurian candidate, a puppet of the Russians, and it never ended, as you remember. It just was constant. They were always on the offensive, and they seemed to be very confident too that they were going to take him out. Now, then, of course, that did fail, but they just went on to other things. We had the lawfare, all the lawsuits that were brought against him, and there was a great deal of confidence that he would be in prison. And then, of course, during the leading up to the campaign and during the campaign, he was constantly accused of being, a fascist. The democracy itself was in danger, and now that he's in power and he's actually, wielding his executive power very aggressively, you get some of that language, but it just seems to be very muted. It's just like they almost seem to be stunned. They just don't. They're on the defensive, and I figured that they probably had some plan. There's going to be Russia Hoax 2 or something, and maybe it'll emerge later. Maybe they're working on it, but they don't seem to have it now. It seemed like they didn't really have anything prepared. It seems like they had their plans A, B, C, but they didn't have a plan D. That's what we're looking at. I'm really quite amazed. Now it's very hard. I'm not going to make any predictions about how this is all going to end. It could end up very badly for Trump. I think the economy is, again, the main issue for most people. And again, I think these tariffs will have a negative effect. And then even absent the tariffs, like if, let's say, you lifted all the tariffs tomorrow, there's always a chance, because of these very severe economic imbalances that we have in this country, that we could go into a very severe recession. And there could be a major financial crisis, something similar to 2008, or even worse. And even if that was, it would be unfair to blame Trump for that, because typically when you look at a recession or, a financial crisis, the seeds for that were sown, many years earlier. But it's just like whoever's in office at the time gets blamed. That's just a fact of U.S. politics. So he could, right now I think he's popular. People like to see a vigorous president, have a sense that somebody's actually doing something. But if the economy really craters, then they could all turn on him, and then the Democrats could come roaring back. It's just too early to say what's going to happen here.
Right. Do you believe that these tariffs will backfire pretty heavily on Trump? That we'll see some real severe inflation? I mean, and it's not something that just contained to the United States. This is something that will affect global trade all around. It's a two-edged sword.
Right.
It just everybody
and other
will
countries
suffer.
can retaliate too. Like Canada already has, and China has threatened to do so as well. There's. I think there's no question that it will increase prices. It's a question of how much. I mean, there are benefits for domestic manufacturers. So we saw, of course, in Russia that a lot of the economic sanctions in an odd way actually helped Russia. And Russia I think it allowed the Russians to build up their confidence, whereas before they thought, we have to have these European products. We can't do that. We don't make it as well. They found out, hey, actually we can. So there's a potential for some of that. I don't know how much. We're not going to escape negative consequences, economic consequences. It's just a question of how severe they're going to be. Now, it could even, like you're pointing out, this is global. We're talking about, the largest economies in the world, the U.S. and China. And when you throw a wrench into the works, you really put the global economy at risk. If you remember that the Great Depression was let's say aggravated, I think, quite severely by the Smoot-Hawley Act, which was imposed tariffs, I think, on all imports, and it led to a global trade war, which helped to bring about a global recession, or that's the way most economic historians see it. So there is a real risk here.
Right. Yeah. It's I'm kind of surprised at just these blanket tariffs. I understand if you want to protect certain types of industries in your own country to grow, to get to a point where they are competitive, if you want to protect your automotive industry or anything like this, but just a blanket tariff on everything doesn't seem to make sense.
Yeah.
So I just,
especially when the objective to me isn't entirely clear, or it's not even clear. Like, for example, I was saying that I think Mexico can fix the immigration problem, and but the drug problem is just not so easy. Just say, hold a gun to their head and say, fix this. They may actually want to, and they just might not be able to, and then it's not clear to me that Canada is really guilty of anything. Maybe they are, and I'm just not aware of it. But it seems to me that this is part of his extraordinary campaign to make Canada the 51st state. I don't know.
Is there any chance of that happening?
I don't see it.
Do you think he could?
Think so.
Well, why would he want that anyways, right? I mean, Canada is if Trump is not, doesn't like the progressives. Canada is quite a progressive country.
Right. Somebody pointed out it would be a boon to the Democrats.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think he's thought it through. I mean, this is the thing with Trump. I mean, I think he has a lot of good, healthy instincts. He's right to, regard the neocons with suspicion. I guess it's more than that, with hostility. But he needs to know the facts, and he often doesn't really have a very grasp of the facts and all the, possible consequences of his actions. He tends to act impulsively. And, and unfortunately, these errors of judgment, I think, could really undo some of the good work that he is carrying out now.
Right. You made a good point, though, that with Russia, we put all these sanctions on Russia, and now Russia's economy is booming. It's improving. Now, I know sanctions and tariffs aren't the same thing, but they're kind of in the same bag.
Yeah.
They're punitive. They limit trade. So, is there a possibility? Well, first of all, how did Russia do it exactly? How did they come out so strong after being sanctioned by the United States and the Western international rules based
Yeah.
order? How did that happen? And is it possible that we could see that there's some type of revitalization internally, sense of pride in
Yeah.
manufacturing or whatever in the United States? Is that
Well,
possible?
I think it
Or
is. It is possible. It's not. You can't say that it is. That's one of those intangibles. You're talking about the human spirit, and um,
I don't trust our
yeah, I
spirits.
know.
To be
Well, part of the
honest, that's
problem
the
is
thing.
that well, let's say in the case of Russia, it became a matter of necessity. I mean, it was something that was imposed from the outside. So this is just like, okay, before maybe I'm a businessman, I just like the chance of the competition from Europe is too strong. People already have this kind of um, this long-standing bias in favor of Western European goods, and it's just going to be too difficult to overcome. Um, but then, bam, it's cut off, and you say, well, okay, it'd be stupid not to try. There's a necessity, and then also I think in the case a certain amount of patriotism too. It's like, okay, yeah, they're trying to destroy us. Well, we're going to show them what we can do. Um, Now, in the case of Trump's tariffs, it's just like so much that the U.S. does. It's expressed in punitive terms. That's the way he's talking about. We're punishing these people. It's not he isn't going out and making that case. Hey, American industry. Maybe he is to some extent, but it doesn't seem to be the main focus of the rhetoric that I'm hearing from him and his administration. Now, the stated reason is really punishment. It's punitive. Now, yeah, I mean, if he, again, I think that might be a good approach if he starts to say that, hey, look, we have let our industry just ebb away. This is a chance, everybody, to build it up. Hey, it's going to cost us something. We're going to have to tighten our belts, but we'll become that great industrial power that we once were. We won't be dependent on China for everything. Let's do this. Let's buy American. I think you do get some rhetoric from like that, but maybe that's something he needs to play up even more. And it's possible. I mean, you can especially if businesses understand that this is long term. See, this is the other risk. It's just sort of it came out of left field, and a lot of businesses are looking like, what's going on here? Maybe these are going to be reversed in 3 months or a year, and businesses don't like that uncertainty. If they're going to make a major investment, like in a whole new industry, a whole new branch of an industry, they need to believe that the conditions that are the favorable conditions that exist today will exist well into the future. And I think that's probably one of the major problems with the approach that he's taking now. He's just saying, we're doing this. These are punitive tariffs. If they, meet our conditions, then we'll take them off. And who knows? He may do that in 3 months or a year or even 2 years. That's just really not enough. I think if you're talking about rebuilding an industry, you got to say, okay, we're putting these in place. We're giving you this, this breathing spell industry, and you're going to have these protective tariffs for the next 5 years or 10 years or something like that. And then I think you would see a lot of investment in those industries. Now I'm sure they're just on the sidelines, wondering what the hell is going on. So I don't think we're going to see the economic benefits of the sort that we saw in Russia.
Right, right. I mean, that's exactly what we were just saying earlier. Just like there's no goal. Like if you're saying that this is an industry we need to protect to grow and be competitive, so we're putting tariffs for this industry to protect this industry so we can grow domestically. Then there's a goal outlined. There's something there. But you're right. It is just punitive. Like he just talks in these terms like these countries are taking advantage of us without really explaining how they're taking
Yeah,
advantage of us. We're engaged in
right.
trade.
It's not
We're just spending
right.
more buying their stuff. We're not exporting more. It's not really the other country's fault.
Right.
I don't understand that
Yeah.
point. And when talking about Russia, the sanctions were unifying. I think that was one of the really big effects of it. It unified Russia. It gave them a sense of pride and nationality. Like, we are under attack. We got to get together. And there was a real, I think, energy that was driving here. Here in the United States with these tariffs, it's going to be hotly debated the whole time. Like, hey, this is hurting us and the tariffs. We don't want this. It's going to cause division with the U.S. It's going to be the opposite of a unifying effect. I think it's going to cause a very divisive effect within the United States, which will make it really hard to kind of have a general overall drive. We're talking about the intangible, the idea of the American spirit or the Russian spirit. I just don't see this bolstering.
Right. It's not that it couldn't happen, but the way that it's being done, it doesn't create that. It's chaotic and it's punitive and and it is going to lead to division. There are some winners from this. Clearly there are going to be some businesses that are happy in the short run. It's just like but there are going to be a lot of losers, and consumers are clearly going to be among those losers.
Right. I'm just thinking, just everything. Think about, price of housing. We're talking about, lumber coming in from Canada. These basic inputs, it's just going to, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, the markets agree with you. It's been a bloodbath, since Trump made this announcement that's going through. So we see how it all plays out. But I think people need to brace themselves for not only in the U.S. I mean, you think Canada and Mexico, they both need to brace themselves. It's going to be tough times ahead. Economically and potentially and probably globally. Trump is also talking about doing this to the EU, not even ruling out putting tariffs on the UK. So it's going to be a rocky economic road.
Yeah.
We'll see how this plays out. Maybe there's some tricks up his sleeve that I don't understand. But right now I have that same assessment. I think that this is going to be pretty damaging to the world economy.
Right.
And maybe he's using it for leverage and they won't last that long and something else will come into play, but we'll see. But the one thing that I do think is good, and I think you'll agree with me, is the cutoff of USAID. I always call it USAID, but I guess it stands for the Agency of International Development or something like that.
You can call it USAID. I think that's not unusual. That's just
okay. Right. How significant do you think this is? I know it was a 90-day suspension. Do you think that this is going to continue further on? Well, I mean, this is a huge pillar of U.S. Hegemony. Of the unipolar moment. This goes hand in hand with Marco Rubio saying that the U.S. unipolar moment is over, and this is what we're looking at, and that's exciting for me. That's exciting. Tariffs, not so much. But what's your take?
Yeah. Well, again, like I was saying, it turns out that USAID played a pivotal role in a lot of these color revolutions. Again, not directly, but by funding other NGOs like IRI and similar, basically regime change agencies and NGOs. It has a large budget. It's something, I think, $25 billion. Now, some of it goes to the innocuous stuff, like to improving a sawmill somewhere. Again, that's what our neighbor was involved in. But apparently a lot of it is about maintaining and spreading Western-led global hegemony. It is significant. It really is. I mean, we find there was a reason that Putin actually kicked out USAID in 2012. And then later, Lukashenko kicked him out from Belarus when he realized what was going on. Again, it seemed like, great, I have this agency in here, just helping out local businessmen or whatever. And they do some of that stuff, but obviously there was a lot more, that was quite a bit more insidious. It's not entirely clear why he went after USAID, but when you look at, again, like Rubio's comments and the decision to put it under the State Department, it looks like maybe he really is going after, the old neocon way of doing things. And he said, no more of these color revolutions, no more of this nonsense. That's not what we do anymore. I hope so. And I think that may really be the intention.
with USAID, is this something separate than like the cutoff of, when we were sending aid to Israel and Egypt? Every country had their aid cut off. Was that USAID that we're talking
No.
about, or is this a different agency? So
Um,
there's two separate things.
yeah, I think it's not considered. It wasn't. Well, I can't say for sure. I actually don't know. They, there was a cutoff in foreign aid, and I guess a lot of that is channeled through the State Department. So I think that's actually basically where it was shut down. Now, USAID is independent of the State Department now, but they're talking about putting it under the State Department. So
Okay.
I think, I may be wrong, but I think that money was not affected by that freeze. But I may be incorrect
So
about that.
for a country like Israel, are they getting money from USAID, or is it something directly from the State Department that isn't associated with it?
Yeah, well, they get
Because
okay. Israel gets straight out, just direct transfers of money, and then all kinds of direct military assistance. As far as NGOs in the country, I have no knowledge of that.
I'm asking that because if we do, suspend all this foreign aid to all these countries, no
Yeah.
one giving money to South Africa, no one giving Ukraine. Basically, every country in the world has USAID,
Uh-huh.
or some type of money from the United States. If everything gets cut off except for Israel, isn't that going to be just make things kind of apparent for the
Yeah.
population? Like, hey, why does Israel still get it?
Yeah.
What is this really America first? Because we did we
Yeah.
did it and we were so good, but like, oh, but this one
Yeah,
country,
well, that's okay.
you know?
That's always been the exception, and I think maybe the fatal flaw in so much of Trump's approach to things. We've always seen that. There's the Zionist exception. There's the Israeli exception.
So you think that will
Oh
continue?
yeah,
But surely I think the narrative, the perception of it, I think people will start to realize like, why does this country or is the only country in the world that's getting this?
right.
This,
Well, they've long been, I think, the leading recipient of aid, from the U.S. and
right.
but it'll just be that much more obvious, if they're just the only one plus Egypt. I'm surprised that Jordan was cut off. I think the earliest reports were that Jordan would continue to receive aid because Jordan is very much in the same position that Egypt is. They're a neighboring country that was basically bought off by the U.S. To to end resistance to Israel, and part of the deal is okay. Yeah, this is not popular with our people, but if you keep on sending us money, we can kind of keep a lid on things here in our country, in Egypt or Jordan. Now, Jordan, we've talked about it earlier, more than 50% of the population is Palestinian. And if there are, the king of Jordan has been able to maintain, his rule over the country, I think in large part because of the economic support he gets from the West, especially from the U.S. But if that ends, that might just be, a pot that boils over. I mean, we may see, a revolution there. So again, I'm
Right.
surprised that aid was cut off to Jordan. We'll see if that changes.
Right, and Trump is also talking about moving U.S. troops out of Syria,
Yeah,
which I think
yeah.
is something that Israel is afraid of. So I'm just wondering, is Israel now maybe getting a little bit scared about Trump? There was a lot of cheering
Yeah.
about like, yes, Trump's back in, now the gloves are off, and Trump is going to save
Yeah,
us.
and we have seen
It
evidence of that. I mean, there have been policy changes that are, again, the very, very minor restrictions that Biden imposed have been lifted by Trump.
right,
Yeah, but we're
but
contradictory signals. You're right. Like in the case of the ceasefire, Netanyahu's still saying that, yeah, I'm going to end this basically. The Americans are behind me. But then there was some leak, I think, or something that was published in the Israeli press that said, no, the Americans are pressuring him to go through with the whole thing and to negotiate the next phase of it. So we'll see what happens. It's again, just never forget that it was in good part the Zionist megadonors that put Trump in charge. So it's hard to believe that he's going to do anything that really fundamentally opposes their interests. But Israeli society itself is divided over the ceasefire. And because they do want to bring all the hostages home, and to bring them all home, you have to continue with it. You have to actually go into the next phase because there are still a lot of hostages or prisoners of war. Often the more accurate description. Some are hostages, some are prisoners of war that Hamas is holding, and they're not going to release them unless the ceasefire continues and they agree to the next phase, and they actually complete their withdrawal of forces from Gaza.
Hmm. Well, Netanyahu's flying to DC to speak with Trump quite soon,
Yeah,
right? When is that happening?
I think it's this week. It's yeah, I
Tomorrow,
think
I
it might be
think, maybe
tomorrow.
even
I
Tuesday.
think you're right, and he will be the first foreign head of state to visit Trump, after his inauguration. So, we're talking about earlier the fact that he didn't go, but now we're seeing this. So again, we're seeing contradictory signals on this. It's hard. I let's you know so much is happening. I think at some point the dust will settle and we'll have a sense of what really is going on. But right now, I'm very reluctant um, to make any predictions.
Mhm. Yeah, we won't speculate. We'll talk about it after this meeting with Trump, see how it goes and what comes
Yeah.
out of it. Um, but with Ukraine though, are we seeing a more rapid shift in the narrative that okay, this war is over now? We have to basically is it basically pretty much done now? Like with the cutoff of the funding of Ukrainian media and a lot of
Hmm.
just their government in general, I feel like things have to be at a point where there's no they know this is over. Trump, I believe, is also pressuring Zelensky to hold elections again
Yeah.
because he's a dictator at this point.
Right.
You know, he did not hold elections; he
Yeah,
suspended
and he
them.
would almost certainly
So,
lose if he runs again for the presidency.
right. So, how do you see this playing out for Ukraine? What is the state of Ukraine right now,
Yeah.
and where's it
Well, it
going?
just keeps on getting worse. The on the front lines, they keep on losing, suffering heavy losses and retreating, and that hasn't changed, and it won't. It's only going to get worse. Their their recruitment efforts, in spite of the very heavy-handed tactics that they use well, we shouldn't call it recruitment, enlistment, conscription. In spite of seizing people out of stores and off of buses and from the streets and all that, they haven't been able to get nearly enough send enough men to the front line to replace the losses. That's something that the Ukrainians themselves are admitting. The Russians say that they lose 50,000 basically a month, and when we say lose, that's killed and then severely wounded. Wounded badly enough that they're just not going back for the foreseeable future. So they're losing 50,000 a month, but they're only able to conscript about 30,000, and then these conscripted, the newly conscripted men are clearly do not want to fight. I mean, they are very, very reluctant. So they're having real trouble with desertion. We're seeing stories about that both in the Western press and even within Ukraine. They talk about high desertion rates, and then just a general unwillingness, a low morale, and a lack of adequate training too. All of these are problems that are really severe on the Ukrainian side and are getting worse. I mean, that's so. But then in the political sphere, yeah, there's it just doesn't look very good for Zelensky. I mean, he's I think really what's kept him in charge is that he has had Western support. He's had a record of getting a lot of goodies from them. He constantly he makes trips to the West with hat in hand, and he always comes back with a lot of cash or commitments from the Western powers. But now, yeah, you're seeing some increasing criticisms, from the Trump administration, but also from other Western European governments. And the push to have an election held is sort of an indirect way of saying Zelensky has got to go, because I think everybody
Right.
knows that if an election were held today or anytime this year, that Zelensky would lose. I mean, that's what the opinion polls show. And if anything, the opinion polls are kind of tilted in his favor within Ukraine. Um, yeah, but then the question is, like, whoever, it would probably be Zelensky, but is he really that different? I think he's shown himself to be a little bit more grounded, a little bit more realistic, but ideologically, he's a Banderite, and I don't really see, hope of a peacemaker anywhere on the horizon in Ukraine. Um,
Well, I mean, I almost feel like the point of having an election in Ukraine is to begin negotiations with Russia. Is that, or is that not true? Because Zelensky signed into law, signed a
yeah,
decree saying that his government can't
yeah, right,
negotiate with Putin.
yeah,
So Putin is saying like, well, we can't,
right,
clearly we can't, we were not doing anything with this guy. We're going to keep on going, but if there's somebody new, maybe we
yeah,
can talk to him and we
yeah.
can arrange something.
Yeah,
So isn't the vote, an election, isn't that a vote for negotiations?
you could say that. Yeah. Again, I don't. It obviously Zelensky himself is an obstacle. Eh, yeah, the Russians have made it clear that they just don't want to deal with him. Really, because of his decree, but also because I think more importantly his past behavior and the previous uh, agreements. I guess I'm thinking in particular of the Istanbul Agreement, where the Russians feel that he simply deceived them. They agreed to withdraw their troops from Kiev, as a goodwill gesture, and then immediately afterwards he tore up the agreement and went on the offensive. So yeah, the truth be told is the Ukrainians in general have had a record of just not keeping agreements, and the West too. So I don't know that getting rid of Zelensky really solves that problem. Is Zelensky going to be a more reliable negotiation partner? I don't know. Again, the guy's a Banderite, but sometimes you get surprised by people, have reputations for being really hardliners. Sometimes those people, like we've said, only Nixon can go to China. If he says, a true blue Banderite, he may be the only guy who actually can make a deal with the Russians because of that. Um, yeah, so
Right.
it could only be. I don't know that it will actually truly increase the likelihood or of successful negotiations, but it certainly can't make it worse. I mean, if we lose Zelensky, is obviously an obstacle to negotiations, and almost anybody else would be better.
So how much longer do you think this war is going to drag on? Do you think we're really seeing the end now? I
I
mean, it just seems so clear to
Yeah,
everybody that it's over, right? I mean, we, especially with Trump coming in, it was already over before
yeah,
Trump. Anybody that was paying attention knew that this war was
yeah.
unwinnable
Well,
for
it's gone
Ukraine.
on a lot longer than I thought it would. I mean, to be honest, so I'm reluctant to make any really clear predictions. I'll make a prediction is that they'll go to the Dnieper this year. Is they'll at least get to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which are the last two big cities in the Donbass, and they may well take them. Um, that they'll take Kupiansk, they'll take Seversk. Um, Now, that's sort of assuming that okay, that the current trends will continue, and then that there will be an acceleration. I think that maybe the Russians, it may not be a rapid acceleration, but there has to be once now that they're breaking through. They've pretty much broken through that line of fortifications, that belt of fortifications. I think really the last true fortress city is Chasiv Yar, and that's close to falling. I think it'll probably fall within a couple of weeks, and then after that, there would be some mopping up to do, and then we also have questions about the weather and so on. But in soon afterwards, within a month after like Chasiv Yar falls, I think that we'll start to see a real acceleration on certain parts of the front. Now there will be the siege of Pokrovsk, it really depends on like where the Russians decide to concentrate their forces. They may decide that they want to get Pokros first. Now, it's not a real fortress city, but it's a big city. And they may decide that it's important to have Pokros because it is a logistics hub. It used to be the logistics hub really for the whole Donbass front, for the Ukrainians. Now they obviously no longer can use it. But the Russians themselves may want to use it for their upcoming offensive. So it may be that we'll see that they'll focus on getting Pokrovsk, and that might, again, it's a big city. If you look at the whole conurbation, that includes Minigrad. But I don't think it'll take all that long for it to fall. I would say like at the most, after the siege really begins in earnest, it'll be at the most 2 months. And then after that, it's just, across the steppes. And I think we're just bound to see a real acceleration, and that they'll go to the Dnieper. That's as far as I'll predict. Now, there's always a chance of a true collapse, where it's just like, it's obviously becoming increasingly difficult for them to hold the line. They just can't put up the fight. And we've noticed that, like these towns are falling a lot faster than they used to. It's a real challenge for them to plug the holes. They used to have a lot of men in reserve. And I just remember that, just looking at the maps, you would see that there are all these different brigades. And then every time, the Russians would, would chew up one brigade, but they had like 3 or 4 other brigades kind of lined up ready to replace that brigade. And that, that's what happened. So there was just very little movement on the line. Now they just don't have the reserves. They're just grabbing people off the streets. They're not getting adequate training. They're sending them quickly to the front line to plug the holes. They can't plug them very well. They get killed, and then new men have to be sent there. So it's obviously not sustainable. I just don't know. At some point, there'll just be gaping holes. They just can't even fill these, the gaps in the line. And when that happens, I think we have a true collapse, and there'll just be, there still is resistance, and they're still able to put up a fight in certain places like Chasiv Yar or around Seversk. They've put up a good fight. But at some point they won't be able to do it. And that's when you have that collapse. And it very, very well, I guess it's hard to predict when those things are going to happen. But it may very well happen sometime this year. And if that happens, then everything will go that much faster, beyond what I'm seeing from the current trends.
Right before we started recording, I was on Twitter X, and I saw a post and these videos of war crimes committed in Kursk, these atrocities where they were rounding up families basically and slaughtering them in their own houses, in their basements. Pretty awful stuff. And I'm wondering, do you think that the acknowledgement of some of these Ukrainian war crimes will penetrate into the West, become that there will be an acceptance that this happened after this war is lost? And this is also something that if Trump really wants to throw the Zelensky ban-right regime under the bus, they can start to expose some of these things. And if they do that, then it's just like, well, we're funding the bad guys. We can't do this, right? Will there be? Do you think that's possible? Because, war is awful, but for the most part, I'm sure there are individual Russians that have committed atrocities and have done horrible things, and that's not okay. But there does seem to be this intentional killing of civilians that has been done by the Ukrainian regime, and then of course by the Israeli regime, and we don't acknowledge that. But I just hope that when everything is all said and done in Ukraine and in Israel, Gaza, that we can take a step back and look at it and say, this was wrong. The intentional killing of these women and children, these civilians, this was evil. This was wrong. And we were wrong to support it. And these regimes were wrong. Like that, it shouldn't be so difficult to say that.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's just very unusual. It's just that's what I've pointed out, is that the narrative is just very tenacious, but it needs to be changed. You're right. Now, I know in an earlier part of that interview that we're referring to earlier, Marco Rubio, he did actually refer to, he talked about the Ukrainian war and said that there was, he referred to Russian atrocities. He didn't make any mention of Ukrainian atrocities. So in some ways he was maintaining at least that part of the narrative. But I agree that if like Trump is really serious about pulling out of this war, that's one thing to do, that he needs to change the narrative and start letting, start talking about these things, because it doesn't make it into the mainstream news. This is like, again, this has been these recent discoveries of, of all the corpses, civilian corpses in this town, in Kursk, is particularly appalling. But it's been part of this war from the beginning and before. It really goes back to 2014. It's just that the Ukrainian forces have been continually shelling civilian areas where there's just no military facility within miles. Clearly, it's just these are meant simply to kill and terrify civilians, and this has gone on for better than 10 years now, or approximately 10 years. And, thousands and thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been killed. It's something that's been gone on, that goes on in this war, has continued through this war. It's just constant. Now, occasionally you'll get the Ukrainians in the West will accuse the Russians of hitting a hospital or a residential building. In fact, I think there was an incident just a couple of days ago in the city of Poltava. There was a residential building that was hit by a missile. Now, we just don't know. It could have been a Russian missile that went off course, maybe because of air defense. This is inevitably going to happen. It could have been, one of those air defense missiles. I think, whatever happened, it was not intentional. Look, I mean, the Russians strike targets in Ukraine every night. And I sorry, but I just don't believe that, like, every once in a while, after hitting all these power plants and ammunition depots and, let's say a military headquarters or whatever, obvious military sites, that they say, well, now let's hit the children's cancer ward. I'm sorry, I just don't believe it. There's just no evidence. But inevitably, something is going to go awry. Either it's going to be one of Ukraine's own air defense missiles or a Russian missile that was deflected by Ukrainian air defense. Now, but in the case of, on the Ukrainian side, we have shelling. We're talking about artillery shells. And, they're just fired into, day after day, into Ukrainian cities. The city of Donetsk suffered particularly. And thank God their nightmare has pretty much come to an end after the fall of
Avdiivka.
Yeah, well, Avdiivka was the first, but there was also some other cities. And then most recently, it was the one right there on the reservoir. I forget the name. That was actually apparently the last city that was within artillery range. And it stopped. And so finally, they're out of artillery range. Every once in a while, the Ukrainians will fire a HIMARS missile into the middle of Donetsk city, and they kill more people. But it used to be that artillery fire was just constant. There's just no way to explain it as other than an intentional attack on civilians. And it went on and on and on, but it just never reported. It was hardly reported at all, prior to the SMO. From 2014 to 2022, but it went on through that time. And the OSCE observers actually did admit that this was there were exchanges of fire, but 80% of it was from the Ukrainian side, into the Donbass, into places like Donetsk city. But it didn't penetrate the consequence. You would see, that's why the Western media was able to get away with the claim that this was a completely unprovoked attack and completely unjustified. And because most people had no idea that this was going on, but it was going on for 8 years prior to the launch of the SMO.
Right.
And so, yeah, we need to change that narrative. If, we have the way things are depicted is that the plucky freedom fighters, the noble Ukrainians against the dastardly, orcish Russians. So they're stupid, they're brutish, and they're just evil, and they just like to kill people, and that needs to change. If you're really going to get a just peace, any kind of long-lasting peace, you have to overturn that narrative. And one way you do it is by start letting the news through, or if you lead the way. People like Marco Rubio and Trump start talking about these atrocities and say that they have to end, and then it gets into the news. It's at least into part of the news, and part of the West will start to see things differently, and then maybe we can. Then it becomes a lot easier for Trump to say, "Hey, why should we be supporting this? They're corrupt, they're losing, and they're also killing civilians. So why are we doing this? Let's get out of here." And it's hard to argue with him, but he needs to change the narrative to do that.
Right. Yeah. There's that, of course, that famous quote, "History is written by the victors." And, that's true. But the problem here in the Ukraine war is that, okay, Russia will be victorious,
Yeah.
but the United States didn't actually lose, because this isn't really a war between
It's a proxy,
Russia and
right?
Ukraine. It's a proxy war. So that way we can still maintain this false narrative here, because we weren't defeated. We can just say like, yeah, Ukraine messed up, they were corrupt and they spent their money incorrectly or whatever. But, that's in that there, but the Russians were bad and they committed all these, it was an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and we condemn it. So that's what I feel like you're right. The narrative does need to change to have a lasting peace, because if not, we may get some type of resolution, but it won't be a fully satisfying or long lasting resolution if that narrative maintains,
right.
That somehow this was just an unjustified, unprovoked invasion and we got to kick the Russians out eventually. And,
right.
That's the fear. Yeah, and then with Israel, who it's just an even bigger mess if we can change the narrative.
I have some reason to hope, in the case of Ukraine, especially in light of the recent statements and actions by the new administration. But but not Israel. It may be that Netanyahu will go. It may be that they're deciding to sacrifice him. That's a possibility. But Zionism is not going anywhere, and the fundamental narrative of virtuous Israelis and wicked, bloodthirsty Arabs is not going to change.
What a shame. Okay, I think we'll end it there.
Okay.
Well, just one last thing is I was just thinking, what if Trump was assassinated? Just how different the world would be, it is kind of crazy to think about. You see that video clip where he just turns just as the bolt's grazing, and if he didn't turn, everything that we're talking about just be completely different. I mean, he's coming in and he's changing everything, and it's going to be interesting how it plays out. It's a mixed bag. I think it's going to be a rocky road. There's some things that I like, some things that I think are going to be bad, but the world is really changing. We were talking about ending U.S. primacy, that this was sort of the biggest threat to the world. He does seem to be ending it.
Well,
he does seem to be ending.
Well, I wouldn't say that he's ending it, but he's taken some very significant first steps in that direction. We got a long ways to go, and then sometimes he talks. Again, like his idea of America first, it sometimes sounds an awful lot like, maybe not exactly like the neocons, but he does sound like an American exceptionalist. Like, we are number one, and don't you ever think, that it can ever be different. And so, like, you BRICS, if you even think about creating your own currency, I'll, slap 100% tariffs on all of you countries. That's
true.
That's not very helpful. It's different. It comes out of a different place than, the neocon ideology, but the consequences are rather similar there.
Right. I think just Marco Rubio acknowledging the multipolar
I thought that was quite
acknowledging
extraordinary.
That
they're saying, like, man, was you watching our podcast or something?
Right. This is something that no politician has said since the World War II or the collapse of the Cold War, at least.
No, it's hugely significant, and it's just amazing how it's not even discussed.
It's not talked about.
Yeah, I heard it from Alexander Mercouris on Friday night. I was like, "What? That actually happened? How come nobody's talking about this? How come I didn't see it?" And then I found it on Twitter. But yeah, it's that for me is an earth-shattering statement that is not getting the recognition that it deserves. So
especially again with Trump, sometimes he just says one thing and he says another, and you just don't know how much weight to put on any particular thing he said. But it seemed to me from Marco Rubio's demeanor, the language that he used, that he understood what he was saying and he had thought it through. That was the impression that I got, I think, in it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's hugely significant.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Okay, Dad. Well, let's end it there. Have a good rest of your day.